Good evening, everyone. The time has come where we ask God's blessings and give God thanks for our presence. Shall we pray? We thank you for this day, O God, one that by your grace you have allowed us to see. You have given us this gift of time to fellowship and to celebrate. Incorporated in this time is food and fellowship. Bless the food that has been prepared. Let it nourish our bodies as your word nourishes our soul. Bless our time of fellowship, fun, and celebration, for this is our practice for eternity. We want to be able to do it well. In the name of our risen Savior Jesus, we pray, amen.
It's the greatest opportunity I get to have week in and week out. It's talking about what we do. For many years, we have had a distinguished alumni award that we give as the Alumni Association. We've also established a new award, the First Decade Award. And the goal of this is to recognize graduates of our seminary in the first decade of their ministries. And to get us rolling tonight, I'm going to ask our wonderful Dean, Susan Garrett, to help us present the first.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to have had this time this evening to spend with you and to have seen many of you over these last few days. It's really been a privilege and a joy, and it's a privilege and a joy right now to talk about my dear friend, Angela Kauser. Dr. Angela Kauser, as you may have read already in your program, is the director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience program, an assistant professor of sociology of religion at Garrett Evangelical Divinity School. Dr. Kauser comes with many degrees, as you can read. She's got degrees, none of them slouch degrees either. She's got degrees from Brown University, the University of Chicago, Louisville Seminary, and Vanderbilt University. And even before attending Louisville Seminary, where she earned her Master of Divinity degree, Angela had been a community organizer with significant accomplishments in Nashville, Tennessee, where she worked with the community organizing body IAF. And in her MDiv, I'm going to come back to that because that community organizing piece has been really central, I think, to who Angela is and to the kind of impact she now has on her students and on the wider church. So in her MDiv work, though, I have to say, at Louisville Seminary, she distinguished herself in multiple ways. It's really actually not surprising that Angela would be the one to get this decade award. She just told me she graduated 10 years ago in 2006. But on the year that she graduated, she walked across that stage, by my calculation, 4 times. So she got her degree, that's number one, but then she also was the recipient of the Fielding Lewis Walker Fellowship in Doctrinal Theology, the Melanie Lane Preaching Award for Outstanding Female Preacher, and the recipient of the George and Jean Edwards Award in the Interpretation of Scripture for Christian Life. That was all in 1 year. And her second year here, she actually also was the winner of the Burton Z. Cooper Prize in Theology. Another thing that Angela did as a student here, she was one of 2 people who helped to found the group Women at the Well, which exists still today. It's an important group for women of color on our campus. And Angela was one of the women with the foresight and the vision and the know-how to get that group going and get it on a good track. During her doctoral work in ethics and society at Vanderbilt, she was supported by a fellowship from the Fund for Theological Education. And in 2009 and 2010, she was a recipient of a William F. Fulbright Fellowship that supported dissertation research in Namibia. And in her research, she lived with and learned from women shack dwellers who formed cooperatives to empower and support one another. You can see the coherence with the emphases of Angela's own life in her work in community organizing. During graduate school, she also served as a pastor at Eastminster Presbyterian Church, where she was ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacrament. And it was my great privilege to preach her ordination sermon. And I actually consider that one of the sort of high points of my career, is that I got to preach Angela Kaiser's ordination sermon. In her work at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary as director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience, Angela not only teaches, but is also engaged in a variety of projects to strengthen Black churches and to teach skills for community organizing. You can read a little list of her kinds of research interests, but just again to quickly summarize, she's interested in topics such as mass incarceration, prophetic leadership, advocacy for the poor, Black mental health and practices to promote thriving, how police officers cope with regular exposure to experiences of evil, and the church's call to be a public and not a private institution, a topic on which she lectured profoundly last fall when she gave the Edwards Lecture. Counting Angela as a dear friend is one of the great privileges of my life. It's hard to know, really, how to convey to you the depth of her character or the strength of her integrity. She's someone who believes and lives as if being a disciple of Christ must make a difference, really should make a difference in the way that we be, the way that we act, the way that we relate to one another. And if some of this sounds familiar, I said something along these lines last fall. I'm going to add a little bit, but this is who Angela is, so I have to say it again. Even as a student, Angela had a way of zeroing in on the most basic but the most important questions at the heart of the gospel. And I often think, when I think of Angela, I think of Jesus saying to Peter, "But who do you say that I am?" So when Angela asks a question, it's like you're hearing it for the first time, and you suddenly realize there's no getting out of answering this question. There's no way out here. She's an evangelist of the sort, for the gospel of this sort described by theologian William Stringfellow. And what Stringfellow said, that the evangelist, the true evangelist, is engaged in loving others in a way that calls them to accept themselves in the same way. The evangelist, Stringfellow said, is engaged in exposing to others who they are and exposing to them, whoever they are, that they are loved by God and thus set free to be who they are. Well, I wrote those words, as I said, last fall, but I've been thinking about this more in the last few days, and I'm really pondering this analogy, what I'm calling the Kaiser-Stringfellow analogy here. So Stringfellow, if you're not familiar with his work, Stringfellow, a great Reformed theologian who walked the walk as well as talking the talk, but like Hendrik Berkhoff before him and like Walter Wink after him, Stringfellow taught us about the principalities and the powers, which he viewed not as inherently evil beings, but as created entities which have fallen away from God's purpose for them, and which at best are prone, well, I don't want to say that. They do important things, like Paul in Romans 13, talking about the powers and principalities as inherently designed by God to keep order in the world, to do good things in the world. But the problem, Stringfellow said, is that they are prone to self-preservation, self-promotion, and at times they seek to induce idolatrous worship of themselves. The gift of the prophet, in Stringfellow's understanding, is to see and to speak the ways that the principalities and powers have fallen short of the purposes of God, and to call them back to their divinely ordained purpose in this world. And so also with the evangelist, Stringfellow said, the true evangelist reminds people of who God has called them to be. He exposes them to themselves as ones loved by God. So principalities and powers, calling them back to who and what God wanted them to be, but on the individual level to people, calling them to be who God wants them to be. And I'm grateful that I believe that is who Angela is. That is what Angela does. And so I see that you, Angela, are one who speaks truth into the political and social sphere, truth about where our institutions fall short. But you also speak truth to individuals. You talk to people and you help them to see who God calls them to be. And that's a gift. That's a gift for anyone who comes to know you. And that's why so many people love you, because they experience themselves in a different way when they're with you. And that's true for me. I know it's true for many people here. So congratulations, Angela.
Okay, now preach.
Preach, preacher.
Former President John Mulder, in this room, asked me to come to Louisville Seminary. He asked me to come here. He said, please come, and I came. Louisville Seminary, in short, saved my life. I was confirmed here as a Christian woman, as a Presbyterian, as a pastor, as a priest, as a prophet. My teacher saw something in me, and that's a loving act to look deeply at people and to see their giftedness and their brilliance. My teacher saw something in me and said, we want you to be a teacher. They let me organize. I did not have to hide that part of myself. And they let me do the work that Jesus did of organizing people so that they could live decent, dignified lives. They let me be a black woman and weren't afraid of my blackness and my anger at injustice. In fact, nurtured it, welcomed it in the classroom. I learned from Chris Elwood to integrate sacred song into teaching. From Diane Rice-Stroffer to respect and honor the power of practical theology for effective gospel witness. From Sue Garrett, the power of excellence, preparation, which honors and respects both subject and student. From Carol Cook, to create a classroom where trust and honesty are cardinal virtues, where they are nurtured and welcomed, and where our students are impelled to tell the truth. From Ken Hockenberry, to learn the theology and the practice of the priestly arts and to step away from the microphone when I read scripture so that the people can be heard. From my beloved friends and pastors, Ann Dybert and Mark Barradin, and the saints at Central Presbyterian Church, they demonstrated to me so brilliantly, in practice, what I learned in the classroom. That is, how to live out the threefold office of Jesus, to be pastor, priest, and prophet, and to do ministry faithfully, lovingly, and prophetically. Most importantly, Louisville Seminary took this little bird with a broken wing, gave me 3 years to mend and to heal, and then pushed me out of the nest and said, fly, little bird, fly. And so in my flight, finally, I have learned from this liminal space, this schoolhouse of the church, how to love God with my whole heart, my whole mind, my whole soul. And to learn how to do that with my neighbors in this place and around the world. I love Louisville Seminary and am committed to it in life in death, in life beyond death. Thank you.
Present our first distinguished alum award is Cliff Kirkpatrick, who we know around here as Professor of World Christianity and Ecumenical Studies, but most Presbyterians know him as Mr. Presbyterian. Cliff, come forward.
Many Presbyterians have other names as well. Friends, it is an incredible honor for me and an honor for this seminary to be able to introduce Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty as a recipient of the Distinguished Alum Award for 2016. I thought when I first heard this news that it was absolutely fabulous, and it reaffirmed my commitment to this institution because, as one of those who now teaches at this place, the hopes and dreams of what will happen when you teach 10, 20 years later in their lives is what has happened with Elizabeth. Is a wonderful demonstration of what we hope and dream for at the very best for Christian leadership, Christian ministry, academic preparation, gospel-centered prophetic leadership and imagination. As many of you know, Elizabeth is chair and professor and chair of the Department of Theology at Bellarmine University. I'm sure it's no accident that we have growing contacts with Bellarmine University, and I bet a lot of that has to do with Elizabeth. But more than that, she is a bright, energetic, thoughtful, smart Presbyterian with a passion in her soul for God's justice in the world, for justice for those who are oppressed economically, for justice based on race, for justice based on gender, for justice based on whatever part of the world people have to live in. It's been my privilege to work with her in all kinds of projects, not just here at this seminary. I've been involved, as many of you know, in the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and nobody's worked more effectively and faithfully for the Belhar Confession and the Accra Confession, for helping our own church begin to get a sense that we are just one part of this greater community committed to God's justice in the world. Elizabeth has written some of the best books I have ever read, and I not only read them, but I assign them to my students, and they go from there. But this book, I don't know if any of you have seen this wonderful book called To Do Justice. It's now, 10 years old? Wrote with Rebecca Todd Peters. It is the single most helpful, comprehensive Christian ethics for our time book that I think anybody can find. I've read the other end of those. I think more recently the book somebody gave me on an armchair, the book on Dorothy Day for armchair theologians. The only problem was Dorothy Day was not one to sit in an armchair very much, but a wonderful book. The work that she did on the social creed of the churches and what that meant for our life. How she's been active. I saw her last time, I guess, at a presbytery meeting. I mean, that may not be something that gets blazoned on your resume, but it's the routine life of sustaining Christian communities. The work that she's done with the World Communion of Reformed Churches, the work that she's done with the Horizons Bible Study for women that help that sense of justice come alive from the Bible, the work in the World Council of Churches and the wealth and poverty and ecology initiative among them. I was struck some years ago that when she and Lee headed off for sabbatical, they went to a part of the world that I love dearly, to Hungary. Many of you don't know, probably the liveliest Presbyterian community, Reformed community in Europe is in Hungary. Unusual in many ways, but so are we, but spent time working at Debrecen University there. In checking my sources for all things historical around here, I had a chance to visit with Katherine Johnson that's been here recently, and she's the historic memory, and while I was not here in the 1990s, I understand that Elizabeth was one of the very best students that ever graduated from this place. But I also understand that she graduated not just with an MDiv degree, but with a husband, and that this was a ground for courtship, and I'm told it was the wedding of the century that took place at the chapel over here. And I think the one who presided at that wedding is right here with you today, Elizabeth's father. So let's welcome him as well to our life together. I must say in summary that Elizabeth, in so many ways, you embody what we hope and dream for this here at Louisville Seminary. That people may come here, may in a sense learn and grow, sometime may find a husband, but that's not normally a criteria, but in the process of that, may come to develop both an intellectual understanding of the gospel, of the work for justice in the world, but also a passion that this world can be different, that it can be a place where poverty is eliminated, where economic justice is a reality, where gender justice is a reality for all people, where we indeed can live in a world that we no longer are destroying as we destroy our ecology. And you are in a leadership role for that. And I give thanks to God for you. I give thanks to God for your wonderful family and for your husband, but I also give thanks to God that you have been connected to this seminary and that you have agreed to be our distinguished alum for 2016. Nothing could say better things about us as a seminary than the fact that we have distinguished alums like you. And so I am pleased on behalf of Louisville Seminary to invite you to come forward and receive the Distinguished Alum Award for 2016.
I'm really deeply honored by this, and I was particularly honored to hear about the other distinguished people who are being honored tonight, Angela and Ann and Charles. This is really a gift to me. Many of you will know that I grew up Southern Baptist. I mention this fact not out of nostalgia, but to set the context for my formation at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. 1992, the year that I entered LPTS, was a critical time for me personally, from a developmental perspective, and in terms of what was happening among Southern Baptists. At that time, I had a choice to go the way of Mara, bitter, or to embrace what the community here would teach me. Where you go, I go. Your people shall be my people. Learning the meaning of this vow of covenant and solidarity wasn't easy for me. It happened over time, days, weeks, months, even years of traveling with others. I want to mention 4 especially important moments on that continuum of time. When I applied to LPTS, I was living in Switzerland on a year-long detour from my usual life as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Jim Hubert, who was director of admissions at that time, kept in touch with me from Louisville to Switzerland, Rüschlikon. He was persistent. Snail mail, email, I think, and phone. He wouldn't let me ignore him. His nudging became a gnawing need to visit when I got back to Louisville. He helped me recognize what I could learn here. Lee and I even worked for him for a while at admissions after we had been students for a couple of years. Another story. After my first year of seminary, I decided to become an inquirer in the Presbyterian Church. I began by attending Central Presbyterian Church, particularly George and Jean Edwards' Sunday school class. After worship, George and Jean Edwards invited seminary students out to dinner. They always paid for our meals and made sure to introduce us to restaurants that needed community support. Those meals weren't just about feeding us. Those meals were an act of communion. I was drawn into the Presbyterian Church by people like George and Jean Edwards, and because of the love of justice that the faculty had here, the faculty proclaimed and embodied in our classes and also in the community. Maybe one of the most important stories comes from my senior year when 4 of us decided to work together on our collaborative statement of faith. We called ourselves the Fab Four. Lee Hasty at that time, Michael Irwin, who's sitting among us this evening, Pam Moore, now Pam Moore Prouty, and me. Lee dug that statement out of a box last night as we were thinking about this evening. We had forgotten the title, Called from Oppressive Isolation. While I didn't remember the title, I remember the debates about overcoming individualism and self-interest. Now listen to a very brief excerpt from our statement of faith. We believe in the God who is revealed and celebrated in community, witnessed to by Augustine, Perpetua, Julian, Hildegard, Martin Luther, Paul Tillich, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Elie Wiesel, Gustavo Gutierrez, Mercy Amba Adeoye, Henri Nouwen, Janie Sparr, Shalonda John DeKendrick. As human beings, we are called to be in relationship with one another. People long to be a part of a community where their stories can be told, shared, heard, and others can respond. We were figuring out that year how to travel together, how to be each other's people. Just one more story to lift up. While I was here, I worked with SLAGO, Students for Lesbian and Gay Ordination, served the Women's Center, collaborated with others who are part of FAUPS, Feminists at LPTS. And I had my first experience as a teaching assistant for Johanna Boss for women's interpretation of the Bible. These were all key to my formation as a scholar and as a human being. They were actually the first times in my life that I was taught and embraced the fullness of women's humanity. The Reverend Jane Krause Jackson, who I also noticed this evening was a distinguished alum, was my mentor while I was serving as a seminary pastor at Jeffersontown Presbyterian Church. She called me not only to name that experience, but she helped me learn how to call others out to claim the fullness of their own humanity, and particularly for women to claim the fullness of their womanhood. There's so much more that could and should be said. Where you go, I go. Your people shall be my people. This vow, this covenant of solidarity that really I first began to explore while I was here at LPTS stays with me. It stays with me in my teaching, in my relationship with Lee as my partner in life, in my family life, with my colleagues, friends, and with many, many allies in this great church. Thank you so much for this honor.
And now I'd like to invite Dr. Brad Wigger, our Second Presbyterian Church Professor of Christian Education, to introduce our next distinguished alum.
Well, you can read about many of Ann's wonderful accomplishments in the program, but I'm here to give you some backstory. I met Ann Jones in 1981 right here on this campus. She was a senior, and I was just starting my seminary adventures at that point. One of the first things I learned about her was that she is an artist. She had even, at that point, illustrated a book that I have right here. It's called Catnip Pie. And there are wonderful little illustrations in here of cats. And I was so impressed at the time, and I've been impressed even more since then with her art in general, with her pottery, with her music, with her textiles, with her banners, all kinds of artistic endeavors. And I've had the privilege of teaching with Ann in the D-Min program here, and I want to celebrate the art of her teaching as well, both as a teacher and her ability to bring out the artist in students and anyone else. If you just spend a few minutes with her, she'll bring out the artist in you. So I got to know Ann, not to mention her great friend, Jane Larson, another recipient of the Alum Award, back in the fall of 1981, who, along with a third, Margaret Crofton, the three of them sang at one of our notorious coffee houses. They sang a wonderful rendition of a song by a popular group of the early 80s called the Pointer Sisters. Some of you may remember. Our LPTS version was by the Pointless Sisters. We have a photograph. I have proof. And I won't say the name of the song they sang in polite company or any more about that. You can look it up. But Jane claims it was all Anne's idea, which gives you a glimpse of the fun side of Anne as well. And whether through the art of drawing or pottery or the art of parody, you begin to see the creative, imaginative, life-giving side of Anne. Anne is a wonderful artist and uses her art to connect people to life, to God. I want to borrow something from the poet Ethelbert Miller. He said something that I think makes me think about Anne. He said, I heard him in an interview on the Diane Rehm show, and she asked Miller, the poet, why he spends so much time and energy devoted to community service, for example, teaching in prisons. And here's what he said. He said, I want to be the kind of writer, he said, the kind of person whose life becomes a poem. So for Miller, poetry is a form of spirituality devoted to the work of love. He sees a connection between crafting words in beautiful and powerful ways and crafting life in beautiful and powerful ways. I see the same in Anne. Anne is the kind of artist, the kind of person whose life becomes a work of art. For her, there is a connection between crafting artistic materials in beautiful and powerful ways and crafting a life in beautiful and powerful ways. Art is a form of spirituality devoted to the work of love, and so is Anne.
Thank you, Brad. That was the nicest thing anybody has ever said to me. You get it once, he says. Thank you to President Jenkins, to faculty, to very beloved friends and family for this great affirmation. And thank you to this seminary, to these to the very renowned professors who have gone before us, A.B. Rhodes, Dan Wessler, George Edwards. And I'll get in heaven, I'm not going to cry. But Leela Rhodes, who helped us through all our vocational and especially our love traumas. She would be really glad that you are married now for all these years. And I feel like we should, now in heaven, she can look down and just see all of us that she helped so much. And we thought we were merely buying books. And remember all those books in the bookstores, and she would carefully write the amount in the corner, but really she was helping us solve everything. And those professors who still guide us, Burton Cooper and Craig Dykstra, who gave a theological construct that I still operate within, and Johanna Boss, and we used to run together, believe it or not, but we did, and we'd run down Beals Branch Road and around, and we argued the whole time. And I would say, Johanna, if you just smile and if you're just, nice and gentle, everything will happen. It was right around the time when reunion was coming, and she knew they were going to leave out women, and she said, we've got to fight for this, and I think she was right, but I just kept saying, but it was really good for jogging. It's a good practice to jog with somebody that you argue with the whole time. And Carol Cook and Brad Wigger, because I love teaching with you all and being with you all more than I can ever say. But truly the seminary and its faculty and its tradition and its history has paved the way for so much creative thought and vocational practice housed in a very sound and very sturdy and very radical theological structure, a safe place to think that way. But here's a story. So April 22nd, and we're coming up on April 22nd, it's my brother's birthday. He always reminds us that Earth Day is on his birthday. They picked it. But 1980, April 22nd, we decided here at the seminary that we must celebrate, or maybe I decided that we must celebrate Earth Day with a gathering of the community down in the beautiful valley, complete with potluck supper and songs and prayer for the earth. And we had a rope that went around that we all held onto, and there was a song about it, and it was a beautiful spring day like today. Then, I don't know if any of you remember, but I had a blue Volkswagen that I bought from Ken Hoagland here at the seminary for $600. And it was my first car I'd ever had. It had holes in the floor. In the winter, you had stalactites that came down from the ceiling. My cat could come and go through the floor. It died. So I was dependent on my bicycle, which I had left outside all this time, hoping someone would steal it and give it a new home. And so it was my only transportation to get, do you remember the Woolworths with the wooden floors by the Vogue Theater that showed Rocky Horror Picture Show every Friday night, the whole 3 years I was here. But anyway, you could feel it through the wall. But so headed to Woolworths to buy the required green crepe paper and green balloons for Earth Day 1980. Alta Vista Road, there by the bridge, you know, where you have to go slow or you might get a ticket. But that day, no traffic in sight either direction. It was quiet. It was eerily quiet. When out of nowhere comes this moving truck zooming past me on my bike. It sort of felt like I was in a Coen Brothers movie. I'm not sure they were born yet. But suddenly, in the middle of this eerily quiet street with just this moving van going by, the back doors open on the van, and what fell out was a globe. And then the truck went on. No sofas. I was hoping for sofas or chairs. This globe falls out, and it neatly broke in half. It reminded me of one of Fred Craddock's sermons where he talks about memory and hope, and they're like two parts of a cantaloupe that broke up but very connected. And I'm thinking all this sort of, but here's this globe, and it's Earth Day, and it's bouncing along the road, and it stops by my bicycle, split in half. Now, as a Louisville Seminary student, I knew it was a sign from God, who always speaks in visual ways. So we used it that night, and we took up offering for the world, a globe from another world sent to remind us to care for this one. At Louisville Seminary, there was something that was affirmed that I knew deep down, which was that attention to the visual connections between text and context and community are intrinsic to our understanding as a body of people of faith. In our desire to explore this connection between arts and theology, because I think they're the same sentence, we embrace these ideas in constant conversation. Because as we think about this visual connection between text and context and reading all the space in between it, we realize that we're looking at all kinds of space, physical space. When I walk into any sanctuary, any room, I'm looking at the lines, I'm reading the space. I'm also thinking, where can we hang things from the ceiling? The communal space, reading the congregation, making justice connections with world space, participatory aesthetics. How do we pull people in and involve them in this conversation? Theological space, connecting text with spirit. And sacramental space, where all space finds a place of welcome at the table. So attention to space, which started especially and was articulated at Louisville Seminary, enables, for me, liberation of word, bringing the sermon from behind a very protected and privileged pulpit. And I think Presbyterians have been subject to the danger of this kind of privilege, so that theology, instead of belonging to the community of believers, too often is just owned supposedly by those who have been trained in a specific way. But I think visual preaching allows both. It brings the text forward in new ways. Maybe it's a quest to move beyond that perfunctory banner that you see in churches, and maybe it was made by somebody's very distant great aunt's cousin's neighbor, and it's there in the front, and everybody's afraid to move it because something will happen, but too small, never moving, nothing to do with the text of that moment. Visual clutter. Visual preaching, opening the door to a new kind of imaginative understanding of text and space in our midst, justice texts, radical God. So this summer, well, actually in 2 weeks, I'm about to begin my 23rd year as Montreat's Director for Arts Ministry. And I'm really grateful because Richard Dubose, our president, came here today, and I think he's going to support me when I say that everyone in this room, when you come to Montreat this summer, you get to make free pottery. And anyway, a few years back in Montreat, we launched something that we called the Arts, Music, and Theology Initiative, with a focus on the arts in Montreat and how we would celebrate that, whether it was a visiting liturgical dancer or concerts or something that I love to put together, weekly film series and weekly lecture series, the Artists in Residence program. And I'm trying to talk Mark and Cheryl to come for weeks and weeks next summer. The Artist House, where artists live and create community as visiting artists together. An effort to offer a safe place for artists in the church to articulate what they believe. Now, one of my very favorite parts of this is that during the summer, there are 10 visiting preachers. They come from all over. They're all really different, and we plan the worship. And what we've discovered is a process that I don't see often enough, which is a collaborative worship planning process, which starts months ahead, which is how I'm sure all of you write your sermons, months and months ahead. And this collaborative process, the liturgy writer, the visual artist, the musician, the preacher, and staff, and we work on this process in what used to be a very preacher-centric focus. And there's nothing wrong with preachers, but they're not the only part of the day. One thing we discovered in Montreat, big stage, bare walls, or worse, often you would see banners with other texts on them that had nothing to do with what was being preached, and I found that almost offensive. And maybe I complained so much, so now we get to do this, and we work as a team. And during the summer, what I get to do with my friend Hannah, who's a trained artist who loves theology, I'm a trained theologian who loves art, and we make these creations, 17-foot tall banners, and they're up for 1 hour. And then they're gone. But 17-foot tall banners, to based on the text, it is writing a sermon through silk or paper. Or one time it was David and Goliath, and we actually made Goliath true to all those specifications in the text and made it out of tin foil that we spray painted with bronze spray paint. It got there Sunday morning, and all of his clothes had fallen off. But anything else we can find. And Louisville has been a great source of trash piles, windows, bicycle tires, my husband's bicycle tire that he wanted to make into a squirrel entertainment center, but we hung it up at Montreat. Visual art statements every week to sort of help us understand where we're going with this text. Found materials, repurposed materials, painted, dyed, constructed materials. Visual preaching approaching every Sunday's installation as we would writing a sermon. This fall, Montreat is going to host the St. John's Bible, the Gospel Acts volume, for a year. It's this big. It's beautiful. It takes your breath away with all the gold illuminations. It is written in the NRSV translation in English, the first illuminated Bible of this scope for 500 years. And in January, its second gig while it's in Montreat, it's coming to Louisville Seminary. It will be here for 3 weeks in the library, and I'm really excited because Sue Garrett and Matthew Collins, our New Testament scholars, are already helping to think of how to use it. Brad and I are thinking of using it in the D-Min seminar. I'm trying to figure out how the group going to Israel will use it as they get ready to go to Israel, but it's Gospel Next. We'll work on that. But I'm thinking this is really notable. January is the beginning of 2017, the 500th anniversary of what? of the Reformed tradition. Right next year, did you all know that when you woke up this morning? So I'm thinking January, having this illuminated text at the seminary, this is our chance at the seminary to do something really radical, to bring together this connection between image, imagination, imago Dei, something the Reformed tradition just sort of forgot. And in my reading, I believe that John Calvin would approve of visual arts in worship. I just think he would. So maybe it's a sign, all of these things, like the globe bouncing on the street. Found objects in your life, found people in your life, found space in your life, found community in your life, found God in all of our lives. Keep looking for those kinds of globes that come bouncing off the backs of moving vans headed your way, stopping in front of you. Thank you so much.
And for our final distinguished alum presentation, Mark Barradin, who is a dear friend of the seminary and a distinguished alum himself and co-pastor of Central Presbyterian Church. Mark.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce one of my very favorite people, Charles Stanford. I had a campus minister who at the beginning of every school year did this icebreaker, and he started by saying, if somebody was to write a biography of your life and could only use a one-word title, what would that word be? If I was to write a biography about Charles Stanford, that one word would be love. Because Charles has taught so much about love. He has lived it, talked about it, and modeled it for many years for many of us. The one Bible passage, among others, that I have heard Charles talk about more than any is 1 John 4. Beloved, let us love one another because love comes from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And that is one of Charles' constant teachings and reminders of how to live. One of his defining moments where he was able to preach that came in the 1960s when he was a pastor in Meridian, Mississippi. And there was a man named James Meredith who was admitted to Ole Miss, which was a state school but had been only white. And the Supreme Court ordered his admission to that school. Well, as some say, all hell broke loose when that happened. What was Charles' reaction to that outrage and fear? His reaction was love. In fact, he preached a sermon entitled Love Disqualified, based on 1 John 4:20. Those who say, I love God, but do not love their sister and brothers who they have seen, can't love God who they haven't seen. Beloved, let us love one another. Those who love God must love their sisters and brothers too. Now, this sermon, you can Google it, not right now, but Google it, and it is in, you'll find this book, The Unsilent South, edited by Donald Shriver, and this sermon is included in that book. That is perhaps the capstone of Charles' ministry, I think, but he's done many things where he displayed love and took a courageous stand like that. That sermon did not gain him points with his presbytery or his congregation, and that's part of the reason he's here in Louisville now, for which we are grateful. But he took courageous stands, was not afraid to love, as he served in Vidalia, Louisiana, Meridian, Mississippi, and for 17 years in Okolona Presbyterian right here, and for 17 years at the presbytery office here that was Louisville Presbyterian, now made Kentucky. And for a number of those years, many of us who were here at seminary from 82 to 96, Charles' office was in the presbytery office, and he opened his doors and let the staff open doors so we could actually see. If they weren't doing confidential work, I sit in on mission committee and campus ministry committee. So when I left here and went to another presbytery, I knew how to serve on a committee because Charles was willing to show us how to do that. He also allowed students to clean up after the dinners. This was fabulous. Thank you. But we learned a lot from that. You know, that was extremely valuable to see how a presbytery worked and to see a loving person be in charge of it. And after Charles retired, then he did 3 interim pastorates and got used all of his experience to help these churches regroup and redevelop into thriving ministries again. Of course, now it's kind of ironic that in his quote, retirement, he is working at the Presbyterian Center as a volunteer for Presbyterian men. And Charles helped, when he was executive, was on the committee that helped bring the General Assembly offices to Louisville. Now he's working there. So we can thank him. He had a great influence on that. I first realized that when I was at a dinner before all this had come about, and when they were thinking of moving here and so on, some kind of a dinner ministerial thing, and our governor, or our mayor at the time, Jerry Abramson, was there, and he came over to the table and called Charles by name, and I thought, wow, our executive presbyter knows the mayor by name. Charles has had other defining moments, I think, in ministry. One was several years ago. We had the moderator of our General Assembly who made the statement, I can't get my head around gay and lesbian people serving churches. But she opened herself to let churches invite her to come in. Central was one of them. Charles, of course, was at a meeting where we invited her to discuss this. Charles said to her in a very nice way, but firm, I will remind you that you wouldn't be here as moderator if people years ago hadn't got their head around women being in position and leaderships here. And when I was in Mississippi, another reason why he's no longer there, when this topic came up, I reminded people, when you're talking about the gifts of women, you're talking about my mother. And my mother is better than many of you men who are sitting here in this room. So, yeah, go Charles. And not in a mean way, but that's just sort of the example that he set for us. Charles has received many other awards for the numerous things he's done for the greater church. In 2014, he and Susan both won a Certificate of Merit for Distinguished Service by the Association of Retired Ministers, Spouses, and Surviving Spouses, and he was nominated by the leaders of this presbytery. So, Charles, I would say thank you for teaching us how to love, for setting an example of loving service, for loving the church and loving each one of us. And many of us are here to say thank you, to honor you, and to say we love you too.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Charles. Well, I suddenly find myself speechless. I appreciate all those good words. I was a bit startled last Sunday morning at Central Presbyterian Church when our seminary student assistant, David Madewell, was preaching. And he mentioned something he heard from one of his seminary professors. And my mind then went immediately to the role of seminary professors. Dr. Caldwell, Dr. Rhodes, Dr. Foreman, Dr. Rule, Dr. Love, Dr. Chamberlain. But then the seminarian said, Dr. Brad Wigger. And I thought, well, of course. Well, there have been a lot of professors that have come and gone since I graduated in 1958. And they have been loved and admired as much as I loved and admired mine. I started seminary believing I didn't belong here. There were too many good people. I mean, really good people. I had never been in such a bunch before. But before I had been here a month, I woke one night with a terrible stomach ache, the worst pain I had ever felt before my kidney stones. I stumbled out into the hall moaning and groaning, And ran right into two seminarians, David Steer and Jim Brown. They hustled me into a car and took me to what was then the Louisville General Hospital, where I was diagnosed with appendicitis and sent to the Baptist Hospital, which was then downtown. Dr. Carl Winter came in the middle of the night and operated on me. The next morning, I awoke to find Dr. Kenneth J. Foreman, professor of systematic theology, standing by my bed. Now, I don't have time to tell you all the wonderful experiences I have had as a graduate of this seminary. Suffice it to say that because I had an office at the seminary for many years, I was privileged to know many of the faculty and many of the students who graced those hallowed halls. And my life continues to be greatly blessed by them. The Lord has been so good to me to bring me in 1955 from Mississippi on a 2-day trip north and let me still be in the South. For better or worse, I still love that fact. And whether I deserve it or not, I'm so grateful for this award and for all the memories that it creates and all the people it brings to mind. I hope to live the rest of my days in proximity to this seminary and all the great and wonderful things it represents and creates for our world. I also have a great debt of gratitude for Susan, my wife, and my children, Vicki, Deanna, and Paul, whom I love deeply, and who honor us all with their presence here today. Thank you very much.
Let's give all of our recipients another round of applause.